As an old wise friend said to me when we were chatting the other day, Simon, we are in World War III. And when you strip out the niceties and see what Washington, London, and Brussels are throwing into Ukraine, not just funds and military equipment, much of which actually never gets there, but the fact from reports that I have that Ukraine's war against Russia is being conducted by American and UK officers somewhere around Kiev. So this is going to have enormous implications for monetary and fiscal policies. First, central banks will have to look at the consequences of war in policy making. Thus, I think it's very likely that with the Fed tightening, less credit going into the system, and with rates rising, that there will be an accident in financial markets. And that will be the excuse for the Fed to stop tightening and to go back by the end of this year back to QE, because the focus, although inflation will be having a temporary fall, the focus will be much more on weakness of the economy and the start of rising unemployment and the consequences of war. That will be bound to come into their thinking. So what we see happening is continued falls in a volatile manner of equity markets into, say, the spring of next year. The dollar falls off its peak and will probably fall by something like 13% into the spring. Commodity markets will continue to fall, but inflation, though having a dip, will still remain high, and we will see a resurgence of inflation accompanied by the dollar falling very sharply later into 23 and 24. And that's late 24, early 25 is when we will get the blow off with long-term 10-year US Treasuries by mid-24, probably rising to 11% plus. So we will have internal problems in the market. At the same time, the war, whether in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East, intensifying. So that will lead us into, frankly, a depression, which will be similar to what was experienced in 29-32. So in that environment, you can see copper prices falling to $6,200 by the spring of next year. And then with QE, inflation taking off because of oil prices probably reaching $250 in the middle of 2024, and food inflation having a massive resurgence, first because of the drought in Europe, and secondly in 2024, the US Midwest has a 90-year drought cycle, which was last seen in the 1930s in what was described as the Dust Bowl decade. So in a nutshell, that's how we see the world evolving. How it ends, who knows? But what we piece together, trying to put our dots together, is that within 3 years, and possibly sooner rather than later, that the new world will start operating their new currency, which is linked to 20-odd commodities, but those commodities are not priced in dollars. They are valued in grams of gold. This changes the global balances enormously. I think it is very likely, from my chats in this part of the world, that it won't be long before oil is sold not in dollars, but in some other currency. Let me give an illustration as to how big the consequences are. We took copper prices back to 1980, and in dollar terms, prices rose by 4.5 times, and costs rose by 3.5 times. Convert the costs and prices into grams of gold, and you had costs only rising by 13% since 1980, and prices only by 48%. So in effect, what the producers of copper were receiving was a fiat currency. It had nothing to do with the dynamics of the industry. And if you look at a 1980 dollar, today it's only worth 25 cents. I think that this is starting to be thought through within the commodity producing world. Do they want to continue to receive a currency that depreciates in value every year? They want value for what they're producing. The problem then is, how is the West, the Western Alliance, going to accommodate this new world? And I don't have that answer. It could well be that the Western Alliance has to go down that route itself. This is what will happen, I think, during the years of depression, which we foresee starting late 2024 and probably going through into 2027. If the new world introduces this new currency, it's the beginning of the end of Americans' hegemony. Will they accommodate this? Probably not. So what does that mean? It means war. I think actually I won't be at all surprised if by the end of this year, the war that's been contained within the Ukraine borders doesn't actually go across into other countries. I think there'll be some event which will force Russia to actually have to use hostilities in order to suppress what the West will try and do, whether it's the Baltic states, whether it's Poland, who knows? These are the events which are likely to happen in some form or another. It's not going to be a war that is contained within Ukraine. I come back to my basic thesis, which is that security of Russia's borders is a very sensitive issue for them, since they've been invaded about 20 times since the 15th century. So NATO, America has abrogated the treaties that were signed in 1990 between Russia and America, that NATO would not advance towards NATO's border, towards Russia's borders. That's been happening. So it's not just Ukraine, it's the whole of their borders.
You see inflation coming down, probably for a number of reasons. Global economy slowing, organic demand destruction as prices have gotten really high, energy supplies are getting constrained, and that brings down economic activity. The central banks are tightening, that's going to start to bite soon. A whole lot of things are going to begin to start bringing inflation down. It's not going to go away, but it's going to come down. At some point, you think they are going to pivot, I guess, to use the common word out there, by saying, okay, we were more concerned about inflation, but now we're more concerned about the recession that we're hurtling into. And then they're going to pivot back to easing. If things continue to worsen between the West and Russia, maybe they're going to, part of that too is going to be easing so they can fund some of the more militaristic pursuits. Yeah. If I followed you, and I don't know if I got the dates exactly right, but you see a period, I'm going to say maybe starting sort of end of this year, where the recession really starts to bite. We see market prices go down. We see prices of commodities go down. Then the central banks, they do their pivot.
What is 10-year treasuries going to do to the financial markets in America?
I mean, it's going to break the credit markets.